promptly, and to let anyone with an interest in this matter to ensure that they're reviewing the proposed rules and that they forward any comments or suggestions they have to us. I assure you that we look at everything that comes in, and we certainly take these suggestions very seriously, and in fact, many of the suggestions have found their way into previously proposed rules because at the end of the day, we want to do what's in the best interest of our state and in accordance with the legislature. So we encourage your comments, the comments from the public. And now I'll pass it back to Justin Hunt.
Thank you, Director. Now, the first couple slides you see here will be very consistent with our processor rule approach. We look to develop a program that ensures a safety to the public and access to a safe medical product. And a large part of that is testing. We had mentioned that we've spoken with consultants. We've used a consultant for these particular rule sets. In talking with other states, there were a few things that they really recommended we focus on. Number one being a universal standard that would apply to all of the licensed laboratories. This will help limit or reduce the likelihood of forum shopping to get more favorable results. It will help with consistency, and most importantly, if our 90-day supply stays as is, it'll be important that if you're close to that 23%, you're getting the same result regardless of where that plant material is tested, because that would really impact that. So that's number one. Number two, flexibility to help with the businesses for cost of testing. One of the complaints that we heard in other states is how expensive it can be. Some of the labs will charge for tests that in fact won't run. And so that was creating some tension between the cultivators, processors, and testing labs in those states. So to the extent that we can help with that, eliminate the redundancies, but also keep the cost down, it'll ultimately benefit patients and help keep the cost down there as well. And last, we want to allow for advances in technology and testing procedures. So while our intent is to have a universal standard, it's not going to be at the expense of new and improved methods or standards that will help our program. So the first draft rules really focuses on how we can get there. Provisional licenses. The key here, and if you remember the uncodified language in House Bill 523, addressed that in the first year, essentially. This testing would be performed by public institutions. So the rules allow for that in Provision A of this rule, and in Provision B, or subparagraph B, it allows for private laboratories to go through the application process, which is similar to what you saw for cultivators and processors. License application. This is very similar to what we had for cultivators and processors. A key difference in the substantive material will be that there is not a quality assurance plan for these testing labs. And the reason for that is the majority of it is going to be handled in rules. Again, we go back to that universal standard, minimum thresholds based on the test results. All of those things we are going to establish in rule, and so we are no longer relying on the applicants to tell us how they're going to ensure that quality. And I guess the rules that we'll go through in detail are specifically the certification and proficiency testing. Application review and award. So similar to the others, you'll see a scoring rubric that will be developed well in advance of the application period, as well as the application instructions. It's identical to that process for cultivators and processors. And just like we had there, we will limit it to a person to one testing laboratory license in the state of Ohio. Certificate of Operation issuance and renewal, we're focusing on rules 4-1-06 and 4-1-08. With the issuance, these provisional licensees will have 6 months from the issuance to meet the conditions in their application and pass inspection for certificate of operation. The time frame is the same for our processors. They may not begin operations until that is issued, and they have to obviously pass that pre-operation inspection in order to be awarded the certificate of operation. Something we're really focused on, and we'll talk about later, is the ISO 17025 standard that we're going to want to see these labs certified and accredited in. That can take some time. So the issue for us will be how can we build steps towards compliance so that these labs can be up and operating, and then we can follow through and make sure that they achieve certification and accreditation within the time period that's allowed. With renewal, we'll have a similar process. It must be renewed before the actual expiration date, and if it is not, that license will be suspended for 30 days and then revoked. Financial responsibility. There is a liquid capital requirement for testing lab applicants of $250,000. The escrow or surety bond requirement, again that is an OR requirement, was reduced for testing labs to $75,000. If you recall, in our rules for cultivators and then subsequently in processors, we added an insurance requirement. And there is language in there to account for whether these products are available at the time of the certificate of operation or at renewal of that certificate of operation. It outlines also a compliance method for which that amount, that $75,000 escrow account or bond amount, will reduce in 3 consecutive years if they comply with the rules and are operating. And so after 3 years, that requirement can no longer be there. Transfer of ownership or location, that's Rule 4-1-07. This, similar to cultivators and processors, it prohibits the transfer of provisional licenses for testing laboratories. It establishes the grounds and a process for a transfer of ownership or change in location of a testing lab. And again, that process is different depending on the percentage of ownership that would change. And it also develops a process for when there is a proposed change in the location of the testing lab. Discontinuation of business. This is the winding down provision, and it accounts for when a testing laboratory would either voluntarily surrender or decide to not renew their certificate of operation. Again, we are going to want to be very involved in that process, and so they will provide notice to the department. There will be a plan around the disposal, removal of the equipment, and most importantly, the analytical instruments and the chemicals that are used in the process. And that plan must be approved by the director or the director's designee after it is submitted. And kicking off with the operations section of the rule, so we're focused on 4-2-01 is where we see some of the more lab-specific rules. Starting off, we are going to require the employment of a scientific director, and that individual at the lab will be responsible for the supervision and training of staff and for ensuring the quality of the practices and the procedures and validating those methods used by the lab. There are requirements for that individual that we will go through. It requires the adoption of the best available analytical methodologies for medical marijuana testing. Again, we are very focused on, and during your review, please take a look at coming to that universal standard. It's very important that we get there, and we think that the rule draft here is a step in the right direction for that. And it also then requires compliance with inventory tracking system. So we're going to need to look at these certificates of analysis, look at the batches that are tested, the lots that are tested, make sure everything is passing, and that the products that are available to patients are safe. So that will be very important. It's important to note, and you'll see in the rules, that with respect to the method of analysis, the current rule version references the Cannabis Inflorescence Standards of Identity Analysis and Quality Control monograph, and we will call out the specific version of that standard. The language also allows for an alternative method that has to be reviewed and approved by the department. And the goal there is to get, again, we don't want this to serve as a hindrance to, as technology changes, these procedures change. We want to make sure the best policies and procedures are being made and they're being used, but that it remains a universal standard. So we would like to see what these labs would propose and make sure that we're approving something consistent with what's out there for other laboratories. proficiency testing, certification, and accreditation. As I mentioned, labs will have 2 years from the issuance of a provisional license to become certified and accredited to ISO 17025 standard. We understand that it can take longer than that, but 2 years is a good estimate from talking with our consultants. And so that's what we've set forth here in rule. We'll also have a process there in which a lab may petition the department for an extension of time subject to the director's approval. So if you remember the insufficient supply, the provisions that we had for cultivators and processors to make sure that they were operating, we have a similar provision here for the testing test. This allows the department to require proficiency testing and third-party validation of the analytical methods that are used, and that will be at the discretion of the director. And the goal is to, it's to ensure that laboratories are capable of delivering the most accurate results in the interest of patient safety. Sample procurement, Rule 4-2-03. This requires that the samples be collected randomly from batches of harvested plant material or lots of finished medical marijuana products. If you recall, we defined in the definition Rule 1-1-01 for plant materials that is 15 pounds where there's flowers and buds, and for plant material where there is not flower and buds, 25 pounds. So we have the different levels there. This also allows for testing of medical marijuana extract for contaminants prior to use as an ingredient in a medical marijuana product. And it allows testing labs to perform R&D analysis so that they may look at the, the analysis of novel strains or strains that are in development, or even improved cultivation techniques. So there is a mechanism for that. We make it clear that if that's what's being done, that there is a label on that package for the certificate of analysis, that is not for sale at a dispensary or a going to a processor, but again, just for R&D purposes. Next, we have analysis requirements, Rule 4-2-04. We're going to establish testing requirements and flexible testing options based on the product type, extraction method, and the ultimate destination. I'll direct your attention to the flow chart that may help understand what we mean by flexibility. I apologize if it may create more confusion for some, depending if you're a visual learner or not. But in the top left corner, you'll see cultivators. And that direct line over is for cultivators that choose to utilize the plant-only processor license, and they can send packaged plant material directly to dispensaries. That plant material would go under all of the testings for those things listed in that box. Directly below that, we have processors. So if a cultivator sends plant material to a processor and the processor just repackages it and sends it to a dispensary, again, it goes directly across and it would have those same tests performed on that plant material. The difference is when the plant material will be sent to a processor for manufacturing. And the processor then would have two options. They could choose to test the extract before it's put into a product. And if that's the case, you would go all the way down on the left-hand side and cut over. And so you would see it would be tested for microbial, basic potency, mycotoxin, heavy metal, pesticide and fertilizer, and then residual solvents. And if that test is performed, then once the product is finalized, there's a much smaller test that would need to be performed on that product. And there they would look at foreign matter, microbials, and basic potency. The last step is if that extract is not previously tested, then it would undergo the same test that you see above for the plant material, adding in the residual solvent. So I don't expect us to all become experts just because of this great flow chart, but I think it lays it out a little bit better. And when we step away today and review the rules, that might help aid you in understanding better what we're trying to accomplish. This rule also sets an analytical sample size, and what we have in this rule draft is 0.5% of total batch weight for the harvested plant material or medical marijuana extract. So please take a look at that number. We looked at the different states, and we heard feedback that 0.25 was not enough to get an adequate sample. We heard that amounts higher than 0.5% were too much from the industry. So we're trying to, there's a difficult balance there that we're trying to meet, and I think this is a great starting point. Doing it by percentage will also account for any batches that don't hit the maximum of 15 or 25 pounds, so that there is not more material taken from those smaller batches. And then with the medical marijuana products, we have one randomly selected unit for each lot. There's also a pass-fail standard, and it mandates that failing batches or lots be destroyed by the cultivator or processor. And then we added an exception there for plant material with respect to microbiological contaminants. That can be extracted, retested, and confirm that it meets all of the required tests, and that then could be made available to patients. And last but not least, this is a pretty bulky rule here. We have minimum thresholds for those tests. It was recommended that we start there. We'll get some public comment, public feedback on those minimum thresholds. But those were borrowed from some.
Sweet dreams are made.